London, not my usual relaxed 10:30 a.m. in Dubai. So I feel your pain to all of our great podcasters who wake up at the crack of dawn. I was going to get up this morning actually and say, "Oh, I'll sit by the window and get the natural light to light up with in the absence of my home studio, my office studio, lots of lights." But I looked out the window and of course it's still dark at 6:30 here in London at the end of a bionic IE week, a marathon, I should say, maybe rather than bionic. Brent crude oil trading down 0.5% this morning at 73.55 for our thousandth edition of this crazy show with three of our A-list, it has to be said, who's been with us for much of that journey. Peter Maguire, CEO of XM Australia, sitting out there making us all incredibly jealous that he's just come in from the Pacific Ocean and we're sitting here in the damp dark of London. Dr. Carol Nackley, Secretary General of the Arab Energy Club, of course, and CEO of Crystal Energy, and putting me out of a job with her amazing moderating at IE Week this week, and Adi Imsirovic, Director, Surrey Clean Energy and Senior Associate at CSIS. It sort of seems a good place to be here, 1,000 podcasts in 5 years later, because of course this is where it sort of more or less all started 5 years ago in March when the world ended with COVID. But before the world ended in COVID, we had IE Week, of course, at the end of February in 2020. And it seems that we're at the bookend of that great declaration by Bernard Looney of net zero 2050, and BP were riding off into a bright new dawn, only for this IE week 5 years later for BP to be once again dominating the headlines for their return to oil, their return to, they've seen the light, they've seen the ExxonMobil light, and they're back. And it's sort of a really spectacular kind of 5 year journey for the industry and for so many things. So that's kind of my intro blab here. I'm going to give Carol a break just to get her brain working. I'm presuming Adi Imsirovic, Director of Surrey Clean Energy, is clean after his blues fest, has had coffee injection, and is ready to tell us what are your big takeaways of IE Week this year. Adi, I know you were there. Carol was there. I was there. Peter got out of town just before the last boat out before this thing started. But Adi, if you're sitting here Friday morning, what's the big takeaway, do you think, from IE Week?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I have taken from talking to my fellow analysts and primarily traders was, first of all, there was a fairly bearish sentiment overall for the rest of the year. There was a little bit of a doom and gloom feeling about the oil price. I didn't see anyone who was particularly bullish the market. The other thing that was really interesting for a change, I haven't heard anyone mention climate change. In fact, when we had our chat on, was it Wednesday? I don't think it
The
was
GI
mentioned
lunch.
once. And
Yeah.
as you said, Looney and BP and going back, the whole industry is kind of turned back to itself. And it's essentially talking back about oil and fossil fuels and China and coal and big numbers for gas demand in the next 10 years, which is not unexpected from gas point of view. I think oil companies, yes, they've been a bit of a topic as well. Where are they going? What are they doing? Is energy transition affecting them in any way, and how? And I think this year we've basically seen oil companies going back to the sort of their old ways, and there's been a lot less talk about energy transition. Now, in my opinion, I don't think it means that we're actually forgetting about energy transition. I think it's all alive and well, and it's happening. But I think with the new administration, Trump obviously has been topic number one, and I'll address that last, and I'm addressing it last because there have been so many diverse views on what's going to happen. And I don't think that even people closest to Donald Trump actually know what the hell's going on. He's coming up with his usual Twitter policies that surprise, and there'll be tariffs, there'll be no tariffs. And I think probably the last thing I would say, and probably most important one, is that a lot of people are questioning resilience of the oil market and how we are going to manage with this government intervention. We're seeing more and more and more government intervention in energy markets.
Yeah, and
And
most
how
notably, you're seeing obviously within that sort of the return of national industry policies. The central government ultimately did Russia even lose the Cold War, never mind the recent one in Ukraine. Dr. Carol Nackley, of course, while Addy and I were out on the fringes, well, I always say that IE Week reminds me of Edinburgh Festival back in my early days when I used to go there and do lots of theatre, and it was a marathon of sorts. But there was always the central event, the central festival, and then the rest of us lunatics wandering around the periphery, picking up the beat of things. So, Dr. Carol, you were at the center of power. You were mingling with all of those world top CEOs at the official event, the Energy Institute's conference. What did you take away from the narratives that were shared there?
Good morning, Sean. Good morning, everyone, and congratulations on hitting 1000th episode. And I feel really a great pleasure that I was part of this journey, and you saved all of us, I think, during COVID time from serious depression, because we had to stay on top of the game and following daily changes in the markets instead of focusing on the lockdown. So that was really an important milestone for all of us. But also I mentioned that because COVID, Sean, people forget, yes, it's past, it was 5 years ago, but I would like to always refer to what the IMF described it as a crisis like no other. And it would be foolish to believe that if the lockdowns are over and the vaccinations are done, then that's it, the damage that happened in the past is over. There are lots of policy changes that happened during that period, lots of sentiment change that happened over that period, but that created structural changes that remain with us today and will continue to be with us in the near future. And some of those changes, of course, they coincided with other developments. And this is why we're seeing today the kind of in some places, yes, I hesitate to say reversal, but we are seeing reversal in some policies when it comes to energy transition, to climate change. And we are also seeing that kind of change in big events such as the IE Week, where it's not like moving away from green energy and the energy transition to focusing back on fossil fuel, but the whole emphasis, the tone, the aggressiveness that we used to see and the kind of the push towards climate change policies and accelerating the energy transitions kind of dissipated. It's much milder today. There is more concern about affordability, about economic concern. Even you see it in outside events like the IE Week, like in the EU Commission, the most aggressive perhaps government body when it comes to pushing for climate change policies. We also see a bit of a milder tone because affordability, economic pressure, people still struggling with their day-to-day cost of living are taking the main driving seat when it comes to energy policy. And we see that people are more concerned about competitiveness of their industry. And they realize today that actually the energy transition is not as cheap as they were told. And I still hear it until today that green energy is cheaper than oil and gas. Well, it depends. It depends also whether you're looking at the entire supply chain or at very specific aspect of the production of electricity. And I think these are the facts that we are facing today. It's not a U-turn. Maybe we have U-turn in the US with Trump. We're not abandoning climate targets, but we're definitely seeing a deceleration in the whole progress towards the greener energy future and a moderation in the tone and in the focus of the discussion. It is today, I would say, it's much more balanced than the polarized debate that we saw only a few years ago.
As one famous lady once said, this lady is not for turning or changing or whatever that for turning, I think it was. Peter McGuire, while we're deep in the weeds of this crazy IE week, thinking it's the most important thing in the world, we end the week with oil prices little changed. Does the world even care what's been said and done here? Does the world care that BP has decided to put 10 billion euros, dollars, whatever it is, back into fossil fuel development and get away from its transition commitments? Your thoughts on the bigger picture out there in Australia this week, the end of the month, the first month in 3 or 4 months where oil prices are ending down?
First off, congratulations, Sean, and it's a milestone that you really need to be congratulated, and to the team for 1,000 episodes. It's just outstanding. And it's not to be taken lightly for what you guys have done globally and that footprint that you've built. So I just want to be a part of it. I'm deeply honored. And my contribution is small to it. I'm surrounded by industry legends, and for that, I'm very honored. So again, and hopefully we're all here together in the 2000 and in good health and happiness, Sean.
Thank you, sir.
Building on that, where Australia positions, and yes, the return or the re-engagement from, and what Artie mentioned, and certainly Carol, the re-engagement of big oil coming back into play. And I think the mantra from the Trump administration, and we all understand it, the drill baby drill, that's just seems to be gaining momentum by the day. Opening up the Keystone Pipeline, what's going to happen as far as consumption across Asia. There are certainly some problems out there if we're looking at the big picture as far as the inflation story, with Japan at 4%, Bank of America tipped to say CPI in the States 4.6% in the next 6 months. All of these factors economically are going to impact, I would say, growth. But the other side of it is that there could be a return as far as positive tone and economic. The big engine of the US to re-engage and get manufacturing, it's going to certainly impact other nations, Sean, from a tariff perspective. But all of these, I think, front and center approaches are going to be a re-engagement of the next 10 years for many corporations and companies in the world, and for the general population to be more prosperous. And that's where I think that we're seeing possibly a little bit of a change in tune, and it's going to be sink or swim, because it's going to be a return of economic powerhouse, and the best man will win.
Or woman. Adi,
yes.
the news of the day, if you like, in terms of obviously a lot of big picture stuff here, and as Carol mentioned, in terms of policy change and so on, but on the granular specific of the news of the day, Trump announced the cancellation of the Chevron contract for development in Venezuela, essentially putting the clamps down back on us on Venezuela, and making again declarative statements about Mexico and Canada's tariffs coming in on Tuesday. Let's just address firstly the Venezuela one, which is a sort of a tangible impact there. Your thoughts on that, of where these things, oil price reacted yesterday, not so much today. Your thoughts on those announcements?
Well, it's kind of hard. I was thinking about it a little bit this morning, because obviously that was one of the factors that slightly supported oil price in the last couple of days. The problem is that in sort of trying to formulate the impact, is that all I've seen is basically tweets. This is an administration that sort of legislates kind of by tweets. I saw Marco Rubio, I think I had a tweet, but we've seen nothing concrete. The problem,
but he's really, you'd say, Adi, he's really in a boy cry wolf window now. If he doesn't press the button on the sanctions for Canada and Mexico on Tuesday, he'd have to say he's a busted flush.
Absolutely, but the impact on the oil industry itself in the United States is going to be massive. I mean, Canadian oil is absolutely essential for the US refiners to maintain their balance, because as we all know, US produces light sweet crude oil and has very, very complex refineries, especially around the Houston area, and they've been essentially importing Chevron in particular, importing to the West Coast and US Gulf, importing Venezuelan crude and Canadian crude in order to make that balance work. Now, what's going to happen? Suddenly, Canadian barrels are not going to be competitive. Of course, I think Canada will take the hit first. They'll probably have to reduce their discounts further. But long term, I think they'll look for alternative markets, obviously. Venezuela is not very, very clear. Venezuela, again, if it stops exporting, which I doubt, it's going to impact the overall global balance because of OPEC cuts. 6 million barrels of sour crude that we're missing in the market. We already have Brent Dubai swaps negative, i.e. Dubai swaps are trading at a premium to Brent, which is pretty crazy. Additional loss of heavier Venezuelan barrels that have been coming to India, that have been coming to Europe, Spain, making up and improving that balance is now going to be problematic. Now, I'm not quite clear whether this policy towards Venezuela is just going to impact imports into United States, in which case Chevron could simply export the oil somewhere else and import something else. So
Well,
in which
apparently
case,
the specific target is Chevron's license to produce a certain substance that dilutes the heavy Venezuelan crude and makes it refinable, if you like, for American refineries. And that's kind of the change. We'll see. Carol, I wanted to get your thoughts on, again, sort of referencing the 5-year journey. One of the big things that happened, of course, after the COVID announcement mid-March 5 years ago was OPEC Plus agreed a 10 million barrel a day cut in order to save their skins and sort of balance the world. But one of the more interesting data points I heard this week in IE Week was actually that not the 6 that Adi mentioned there, but that of the cuts that still exist for OPEC Plus, but actually 10 million, because when you add Iran and Venezuela and Nigeria and Libya, all of those other OPEC Plus countries, you've at least another 4 million of disrupted supply from them for multiple reasons. So OPEC Plus sitting on all of those cuts, big decision next week. Your thoughts as they absorb all the things we're trying to absorb. What sort of decision do you think they're going to make?
It's hard to guess because at the moment, the way I see the oil market evolving is that you have these kind of uncertainties introduced by the Trump administration. When it comes to tariffs, Sean, I don't think only it's just a question of supply into the US. As an economist, I see tariffs as a macroeconomic issue. And it's not if it was just a one-off increase in price, fine, the market will adjust. But what is more worrying is the tit for tat responses, and that by itself creates some kind of trade war, which would be detrimental to global economic growth at a time when you have this the biggest importer of crude oil, that is China, is struggling with a structural economic problem. That by itself creates the biggest uncertainty when it comes to oil demand growth in the market. And that may push OPEC Plus to reconsider its decision in April. That said, they might do it like nibble by nibble approach, like step by step, because you have the sanctions you mentioned on Venezuela, removing the license from or canceling the license from Chevron in Venezuela, potentially increasing the pressure on Iran and reducing its exports to only 10% of the levels where they are today. And we shouldn't forget that under the Biden administration, despite the sanctions, Iranian exports tripled. So there could be a way whereby by removing or exercising further pressure on some of the existing players before the demand weakens, there could be room for some additional barrels. But honestly, the way I see the oil market is I don't see the situation changing drastically from where we are today. And I would like to wait and see what OPEC Plus will do. But so far from what we read, there are some rumors that we could see another postponement of the decision. So I don't know what they will do, to be honest, next month. I was thinking about it. But if they are concerned about the impact of tariffs on global economic growth and therefore demand, then they would be in a position to postpone further the increase in the barrels as of April.
Peter, that sort of nicely segues to you, and because really all eyes turn to China now, because on the list of things coming next week is another 10% on Chinese 10% US tariffs on Chinese goods into America. They took the first 10% kind of on the chin, fairly sotto voce. They have a second 10% now to digest. Right the day before their senior Politburo has their very important annual meeting to declare what the growth target for next year would be. How do you think China reacts and digests this another round of tariffs?
I think one of confusion, Sean, in some ways, and how they're going to, if there's any form of retaliation that they can look at, they've got their, in some ways, some of their markets are performing extremely well when you look at their technology sector. It's absolutely screaming. It's on fire. It's had a growth of around about 50% in the last year compared to the Nasdaq. It's so there's that side of it if you strip away, and then you're looking at the industrialization of China. I think it's copper. You're looking at steel and aluminium, those sort of tariffs as well. We all understand that copper predominantly comes from China, and that's going to be impacted naturally when President Trump and Howard Lutnick was talking about bringing from the commerce side, bringing copper back in and making it a manufacturing, I suppose, again, powerhouse for base metals and industrial metals. So I feel as though that China's very much under attack in a lot of ways, Sean, and that's going to be, again, fascinating for a country like Australia, how that plays as far as an export-driven model with iron ore, that is, and a lot of our other base metals being exported.
What about, Peter? I've heard again in IE Week this week, and I seen it just reading the FT this morning. IE Week is a bit of an echo chamber, so eventually everything ends up in the FT by the end of the week.
Yes.
And that was that this could be bullish for China, because finally China might unleash their stimulus bazookas that they've been sort of tepidly doing over the last 6 months. And now this will be the moment where, okay, they've got to go all guns out to revive and sustain the Chinese economy. What do you think their appetite is for that?
Well, they'd have to. I think that's the only way forward. There's still that property overhang, and that's the debt associated with that really hasn't dissipated, from a big picture scenario, Sean. So yes, all guns blazing. The only way you can compete against an aggressive component or opponent, being President Trump, is to fight fire with fire, and you've got to stimulate your own economy. And that needs to be, looking at different markets to export to, drive, I suppose, consumption across very much all of your trading partners, and internalize a lot of that economic capacity for your own market. Because when you're looking at the uncertainty with President Trump, is this where it's going to end, this 10%, or is this going to be slowly ratcheted up? And we're talking here in June, and you say, Peter, it's at 35 or 40%.
Well, of course, it's an extra 10 on already a 10 that was announced a few weeks ago. And
right.
that 10 was already on top of, I think it was already existing 40% or so. So the tariffs on China now with this next 10% are tipping it into sort of 50, 60% territory. Let's go to the survey question and get it's all about OPEC Plus, in essence, what sort of decision they're going to make next week about their April 1st Q2 policy. What will OPEC Plus decide to do with Q2 oil supply? As is currently declared in their policy, it's to raise supply from the 1st of April. Will they proceed with that? Number one option. Number two, maintain the cuts for Q2, extend them, as Carol indicated, as we've heard a lot of that. I think that would have been the consensus view at IE Week this week, was number two there, maintain cuts for Q2. Or will they even go one step further and do a full extend the cuts to the end of the year? Of course, and it gets all really confusing and ultimately, but OPEC Plus has a very large amount of cuts that add up to some 6 million plus. But the ones that we're talking about coming back in April are the 2.2 million that belong to the 8 countries that are of the 20 something that are part of this whole thing. And the rest of the cuts are actually locked in and committed to the end of the year. Will OPEC Plus take the 2.2 and put them in the rest of the year bucket? That's option number 3, which would certainly sort of be a somewhat bullish signal to the market, which maybe it needs at this window. Adi Imsirovic, another big debate discussion point for the IE Week, and one that was somewhat unresolved but necessarily pretty important, was, would Europe, in all of this sort of, we've got the president of Ukraine going to Washington, D.C. as either today or the coming days to sign this here you can have all my minerals deal, and will Europe turn back to Russian gas? Will Europe turn back to Russian diesel? Where do you think, if this momentum towards a deal with Russia starts to accelerate, as Trump seems to want to do, where does Europe and where do energy flows go?
Yeah, $50 million question, Sean.
Or billion, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. The thing is, I guess Europe is learning how to live with Trump slowly. We've seen Macron, we've seen Keir Starmer going over there, and I think European leaders are basically going with the flow. It's very, I mean, the uncertainty is just way too great. There's no point opposing or arguing. You just go with the flow and see what happens. I think I mentioned earlier from traders' point of view, and I've spoken to a number of my colleagues who are still trading out there. If it's legal to move Russian oil into Europe, I think people will do it.
Well, if
As I said
LNG is
earlier on,
anything to go by, it's legal to move LNG from Russia, and my God, are they doing that in large volumes?
absolutely spot on. And in many ways, whatever was legal just went on and on. And, as you rightly said, LNG is one very good example. So I don't see any problem there. I mean, there's a number of sort of layers here that we can open this Pandora's box, if you wish. First of all, Zelensky is going to sign something giving half to Donald of something they don't have anyway. I don't think they have any particular mineral riches other than coal and so on. I don't think they have much to sign, but it looks good, so they'll probably sign. Second thing is we still have negotiations with Russia between the United States and Russia. Started in Saudi Arabia, and somehow Europe's been isolated. But as I mentioned to you a couple of days ago, if there is a peace, it's reached at some sort of borderline, as it is, for example, somebody has to step in and put boots on the ground. Who's going to do it? We know that Donald's not going to do it. So doing this and expecting then Europe just to basically come in and look after this peace without them being involved, it just doesn't make any sense.
And
Secondly,
sorry, go ahead.
Secondly, I don't think it's going to be a particularly lasting peace. I think unjust peace is not going to last very long. Secondly, I think that for Putin, having a peace with Ukraine without having achieved objectives, i.e., having got rid of Zelensky, is not a solution. I think Putin either wants to control Ukraine or basically ideally have somebody else who is sort of more leaning towards his policies. So from Russian point of view, that would be just taking a breather, and I don't think it's a long-lasting solution. But hey, in the meantime, if there is some sort of even half-baked peace, I think oil will start moving very, very, very quickly to Europe. I think it will be bearish, and I think the biggest impact will be on so-called OPEC plus. As you know, Sean, I never like to talk about OPEC plus because I think it doesn't really exist in reality. I think plus is a joke. It's just Russia, and we know that Russia's never done anything to support the market. And if there was a peace, I think Russia would just be all out. They wouldn't need OPEC anymore, and they would just go on their own way. But in reality, I don't think anything really significant would change other than sort of everyone starting to say, well,
so nothing's going to happen in a hurry here, it seems, despite all of the bombastic headlines. Dr. Carol, of course, in our neck of the woods here, and not here in the Middle East because I'm in London today, but ultimately there's similar vulnerabilities in the Middle East. The Israeli-Gaza Hamas sort of ceasefire is coming to the end of its first phase. Second, it looks vulnerable, the region. Where do you think that's at? The oil markets are obviously somewhat agnostic, it would appear, to any geopolitical risk premium these days. Are they being a bit naive? Your thoughts on where the Middle East is going and its vulnerabilities?
Yeah, we don't have much time to talk about vulnerabilities of the Middle East because there are quite few and still alive and influential. But few things, and it also applies to whatever happens in Ukraine as well. A ceasefire is not peace. And the Middle East remains as fragmented as it used to be. And even in Syria, people are ask me today, for example, about Syria, shall we start doing business in Syria? I say it's still super fluid. The situation with Iran is super fluid. Gaza, Hamas, Israel, even in Lebanon, Hezbollah still exists. Maybe not the same military power as it used to be, but it's still there. So Middle East remains fragmented. But when it comes to the question about the impact on oil markets, we shouldn't forget the plain fact that it's not that the market is ignoring geopolitics or the geopolitical risk premium. It's just there's simply too much supply chasing too little demand growth. And that's why we see there's too much safety cushion in this form of spare capacity in the system. And that has dampened the geopolitical risk premium. But I would like to say the last few words to go back to the situation in Europe and to comment on your question about Russian gas supply if a peace deal is signed. First of all, that peace deal will take a while to sign, but we shouldn't forget the European gas market today, post-Ukraine war, is not the same as the pre-Ukraine war. Many countries in Europe, including Germany, which are solely dependent on pipeline gas from Russia, moved to LNG for the first time, and they signed long-term deals. So even if Russian gas comes back fully to the European market, the market dynamics, the competition dynamics have changed significantly. That is not going to be the same. And this is something we should be aware of in case a peace deal is signed with Russia.
Peter, last word to you. Another sort of narrative that kept popping up in IE Week was the idea that, yes, China, and even the most maybe profound data point I heard this week was Ed Moore saying that Chinese economic growth was closer to 2 to 2.5% last year, not 5. But the idea that the rest of Asia can help to make up for some of this sort of flattening demand growth out of China. Your thoughts on that, the rest of Asia?
Sean, if I look at the footprint of it, I mean, strong economic growth from Indonesia. Malaysia and Thailand are doing quite well. You look at the likes of Japan, economic powerhouses performing incredibly well. And as that's demonstrated with inflation of 4%, the economic growth there is bubbling along quite nicely. Vietnam, relatively strong. So I think that that catchment area will provide some support. And naturally, it's very much an engine room of Asia. You've probably got the best part of nearly 1 billion people wrapped up in there outside of China. So there's a lot of consumption, and I can't see that storyline with young people, entrepreneurship and innovation at the start of their mindset. I don't see any handbrake in the short to medium term, Sean.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. 1,000 must go to bed. The maintain cuts for Q2, overwhelming choice in this room. I just want to wrap up with another sort of thing I heard this week in London that again is echoed in the FT editorial board article this morning when they're talking about BP and the decisions that BP have made vis-a-vis are they betting on a dying horse, if you like. But what I heard in London this week from a senior Gulf NOC executive, which was on a stage and not in a private conversation, was that one has to not forget that we're getting closer to the date when the national energy companies of the Middle East are going to eventually just open up the taps and no longer be going for some sort of price elevation, but going for market share, which was touched on in the editorial board report today in the FT. I'd recommend a reading of it about BP choosing to bet all the horses on oil again at a time in which that is a peaking environment. So, and a part of that peaking environment will include the big national energy companies of the Gulf finally saying, okay, halas, enough of this. UAE hasn't spent $20 billion to carry 2 million barrels a day of idle capacity indefinitely into the future. So I think that is a big question. It's not today's question, but it's maybe one for the next 1,000 episodes. And before we get there, it might be a reality. Peter McGuire in Australia, awesome. Adi Imsirovic in Surrey, and Dr. Carol Knackley wandering the world all the time, but today in London. Thank you so much for everything. And thank you to our 100 podcasters all around the world who've made the last 5 years and 1,000 episodes possible, interesting and insightful. And it's always great, like we had this week in London, opportunities to get together in person. We were joking around the table on Wednesday that we needed to come in with little frames around our heads so that people would be able to recognize each other. All the best. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
All the
Thank you,
best.
Sean. Bye,
Thank
Carol.
you,
See you,
Sean.
Artie.
Cheers, Peter, Carol. Bye.